You can't destroy it. You can smash it. You can try to break it up, but gold is gold. You put acid on it, it doesn't affect it. That's why these Spanish galleons that have been under the ocean, salt water for 400 years, 500 years, it has no impact on gold. It just exists. It's the only thing in the known universe that I say is eternal. You cannot destroy it.
This is Little by Little with Andy Schectman.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Little by Little with the founder of GoldMoney, James Turk. For any of you people who've been following the metals market as long as I have, a man who needs no introduction. James, I was talking to you offline, and you commented on the name of my podcast, Little by Little. And it comes from the term or phrase logarithmic decay, where things happen little by little by little by little, then all at once. And your comment to me was interesting about gold. Could you elaborate a little bit? I think people will get a kick out of that.
Yeah, there's two elements to it that immediately came to mind. One was, wealth accumulation is done little by little over time. And gold and silver, too, for that matter, are a great way to do that. You can't save fiat currencies anymore. Saving money is always important for an uncertain future. And the best way to do that is just accumulate physical gold and physical silver. And little by little, over a long period of time, by the time you retire, you'll be quite happy with the size of your retirement. The other aspect to it is that in terms of the logarithmic decay, it applies to everything except gold. Gold does not decay. It's something that is eternal. It's the only thing in the known universe that is eternal. You can't destroy it. You can't change it. An ounce of gold in Roman times is the same as an ounce of gold today. So it is truly unique. And what I call it is natural money. And in my last book, Money and Liberty, I developed the idea of the theory of natural money and why gold really is money. It's an asset class by itself. It's not really a commodity. It is money. It's something different than commodities.
Well, I'm glad you said both of those things. That's how I look at it. I look at it as money. I look at it as wealth, not as an investment. I've always been very clear on that. And interestingly enough, and I don't think you know this about me, but when I started this company with my father 35 years ago, he said to me one rule and only one rule, and that is that I will buy some gold or silver every 2 weeks when we get paid. That he wouldn't allow me to make the same mistakes he made as a younger man, and he wanted to force me to save. Now, that was the best gift that I've ever been given. And you're right. Little by little, I have accumulated every 2 weeks for now 35 years this February, whether it be 1 ounce of silver or whatever it is, something. And the power of the laws of compounding are truly extraordinary. And I like how you sum that up. And thank you for sharing that. I couldn't agree more. Personal backgrounds always fascinate me, and your career had you starting at Chase Manhattan Bank, which became JP Morgan, I believe, to being the managing director of the commodity department at the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. Talk about fascinating, ultimately leading you to founding GoldMoney. Can you share a little bit about your journey and maybe highlight any significant defining moments that helped shape this path, which is a path that most people in commercial banking probably wouldn't have taken? So any highlights along the way that you care to share?
Well, you referred to your father. I refer to my parents and my grandparents too, for that matter. My father was born in Austria. My mother was Slovenian. And they taught me and my sisters, the idea of, gold and silver are money, and basically everything else inflates. Having lived through the Austrian hyperinflation, my grandparents came to the United States, which is where I was born. I'm a first-generation American. So I've always been interested in money and finance. Actually, though, when I was younger, I thought I'd be an architect. But once I got into it a little bit and realized there's a lot of engineering things that didn't interest me, I just focused on a career in international finance. And Chase offered that opportunity to live and travel abroad. And in that regard, I grew up more in a European family than I did in an American family, in the sense that I always had a worldview because of what I've learned from my parents and how they saw things around them. And I've been fortunate to travel to over 50 countries. I've lived in 7. I've lived in Asia. I've lived in the Middle East, and obviously I've lived in the States as well. So it's been really a fascinating career, and I really consider myself to be quite fortunate. And for that reason, because of the experience and knowledge that I've gained, I'm always quite happy to share it with people who are interested in hearing about it and listening to some of the things that I've learned, with the idea that I could pass it on to others. I did that with my book. I dedicated it, Money and Credit, to my 2 sons, Charles and Jeffrey.
Do you think, and I spent a good deal of time in Zurich as at the very beginning of my career, as we were still have a relationship with BFI Consulting in Zurich, but we were the U.S. Counterpart to BFI Consulting. And I spent a couple of summers as a young man learning from Swiss bankers. Do you think having that European perspective gives you a better, are you more inclined to see gold's role as money coming from the European perspective, where borders are just a few hundred miles apart, where conversion rates, where the value of a currency is not as arbitrary as it is with the dollar? In other words, you understand the whole mix of the macro cycle and of valuations of currencies and just an acceptance to gold. Is that something that the Europeans understand better than the Americans?
That was definitely true 50, 60 years ago when, I was a teenager or starting my business career. It's less true today because of, what's been happening, globally. Plus, my own experience is influenced by my grandparents who suffered, along with everybody else, in the Austrian hyperinflation in the 1920s. But yes, I do think there is still some difference in terms of having that global perspective that you get from you find more often in Europe than you do find in North America, unless you're talking to people in the middle of the country, the farming community, because they have to be very much attuned to what's happening around the world, not only to prices of the crops that they're growing and exporting to various places, but also to the dollar itself.
You're very smart. I've found that following advice from commentators that have a European slant seem to enlighten me more than others. And some of my largest, most sophisticated clients are farmers, who many of which don't have even formal education. They just understand it. They understand the concept of commodities, of hedging, of risk tolerance, of all of the things that I think are very important when we talk about trying to figure out our financial direction. It's interesting. Farmers seem to have a grasp better than most. And I would say that's been very true my entire career. Interesting point. Let's switch gears a little bit, James. Let's talk about the current administration, or the one on their way in, President-elect Trump. How do you think his policies will impact gold? And, Scott Percent, largest holding gold. Judy Shelton was a former advisor, maybe back on the team. We don't know yet. But all we hear him talking about is Bitcoin for the most part. How do you think it will go in terms of gold?
That's an interesting question. I hope it goes in a constitutional way. Article 1, Section 8 says that the federal government has the authority to coin money. It doesn't have the authority to print currency. And if it doesn't have the authority delegated to it in the Constitution, it can't give that authority to someone else. So the Federal Reserve is an unconstitutional entity. Whether the incoming administration takes a constitutional point of view or not, the odds are they won't, because it's been pretty much ever since the 1930s to kick the can down the road, change the nature of how the states and the Constitution and individuals living in the states are meant to interact with one another. But, the country that we have today is not the country that the framers of the Constitution created.
Couldn't agree more. Although, the more things change, the more they do stay the same in a slight way, in the respect that we have 11 states that have passed those legal tender laws, understanding that they can't create their own currency, but they can if it's gold or silver. And you have 11 states now that are passing legal tender laws saying gold and silver coins would be made by a sovereign would be used for all debts, public and private, even going as far as paying your property taxes. Upwards ends of 21 more have it in front of their legislatures. So maybe the American spirit is alive, and that is a little bit of a pushback against the lunacy of our monetary policy. So I'm very hopeful in that respect. And
I am too, Andy. And my eyes went up when you said the American spirit, because the American spirit is still very much alive. And I think it's had a revival recently as people realize that their liberties are being eroded and taken away from them. In that sense, the pandemic was a real wake-up call, and we're still dealing with the consequences of that. But in addition to what the states are doing, the Supreme Court also made a very useful step in the right direction with the Dodd's decision, which you recall was the one related to abortion. They decided that this is not an issue for the federal government to decide because there's nothing in the Constitution about it. And as a consequence, they said it should belong to each of the states. So I think in an article that I just recently wrote called How to Make America Great Again, that is the path that we should follow. The federal government was created by the states for three specific reasons. It was to create a common defense because Britain was still in Canada and the Caribbean and posed a threat, and Britain eventually did invade, leading to the War of 1812. They also wanted the federal government to create the mechanism so that interstate commerce would not be hindered by putting barriers against trade within the country itself. And the third thing, of course, was the federal government was authorized to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Now, regulate the value thereof is often very much misunderstood. What it really did is it was giving Congress the authority to set the gold-silver ratio so that it could always be adjusted to market, what was prevailing in the market. Because if it didn't adjust, the undervalued metal would be exported, and as a consequence, there may not be enough metal on hand to do their function of coining. So, regulate the value thereof is just basically fixing the gold-silver ratio. So, those are the three elements of what the federal government should be doing. The rest of it should be done by the states. And I'm sort of hopeful that, with this movement that the states are doing in terms of restoring constitutional money in their own borders, maybe in time, maybe not in my lifetime, but eventually we'll go back to a constitutional government and return to the mechanism that was in place by the framers. We would also have to get rid of a couple of the amendments that the progressives introduced in the 20th century. The 20th century was a disaster as far as the original intent of the Constitution. But we can reverse that, just like the Volstead Act, the Alcohol Prohibition Act was essentially reversed. But I just want to make one more last point about what you brought up. In the 1930s, you had the Gold Clause cases, and they were fundamental. They fundamentally changed the relationship between individual and government. It said that by refusing to rule on the gold clauses, this is a consequence of the confiscation by Roosevelt in 1933, where he took the gold out of people's hands. As a practical matter, he took the gold out of the banks, which is where it was and easy to get at. Most of the people didn't turn in the gold because they realized it was at the time that it was an unconstitutional act by the president of seizing private property in that way. But be that as it may, because of the Gold Clause contracts and the refusal of the Supreme Court to hear that, what they essentially did is they broke the most fundamental thing of law, that two people have a right to contract with one another, and the law should protect the rights of both individuals following the terms of that contract. The Supreme Court basically was saying that the federal government can break a contract anytime it wants because of a variety of factors. At that time, it was the Great Depression, which was blamed wrongly on gold and the gold standard instead of fractional reserve banking of the banking system. But as a consequence of that, everything has been changed. I like to make the point to visualize it as a waterfall. What the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution, organic American law provided for, was the individual was at the top of a waterfall, a vision of waterfall. The individuals then, through their states, delegated certain powers to the state government. And then at the bottom of the waterfall, the states delegated 17 specific powers related to those three areas that I mentioned to the federal government. What's happened from the 1930s on, but it started even earlier than that when the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and the income tax was created, changing the apportionment requirement that the Constitution had prohibited, and then also the taking away the rights of the states to appoint senators and making them available, making them become a popular vote to take office in the Senate. Because of those changes, that waterfall was turned upside down. At the top of it now is the federal government. At the very bottom is the individual. That's not the way it's supposed to work. That's not the way the framers created it. That's not what America fought for in the Revolution, throwing away the feudalistic social contracts that had established up until that moment in time. But believe it or not, for whatever reasons, mainly the propaganda of the progressives and the increasing control of the elite, we've moved away from that, and we now have what we have. And I think that's why people are so upset. They see their liberty, their freedom, their choices eroding, and people don't like that. And that's the message of history. People don't like being told what to do. There's a great definition of capitalism that I put in my book. It's by a London professor. He says capitalism is what people do when you leave them alone. They pursue happiness with this, which is what Jefferson was all about with the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Property is one element of the pursuit of happiness. There are other elements of the pursuit of happiness. It's letting people live ethically according to natural law, and that's the key element.
Why do you think it's been so vilified and turned upside down, and this socialistic agenda, this move towards socialism, where you poll the young people today, and there's a or at least over the last several years, there's been a large majority of young kids who think that capitalism is evil, that it only enriches the top, and that the pathway to happiness is through socialism and this redistribution of wealth. Why do you think that's taken hold? How did we get so far away from our founding principles?
Yeah, I really don't have the answer to that. But, obviously, in my view, it's the elites just slowly over time gaining control of the monetary system. Because once you have control of the money, you have control of the economy. And if you have control of the economy, you have control of the people. I read back in the 1970s, as I was learning more and more about what gold is, a brilliant speech that Howard Buffett, the father of Warren Buffett, gave in 1948. Howard Buffett was a successful Omaha businessman, and he served a few terms in Congress, which is how the framers envisioned it. Successful people would do their civic duty and spend some time, whether state government, federal government, or even just local government, giving back a little bit what they've learned, particularly as they become older. And as a consequence, he gave this speech, and in it, he made the observation that Mussolini, Hitler, and Lenin all confiscated gold. He didn't mention Roosevelt. I guess he was being politically correct at the time, but Roosevelt confiscated it too. Why did they do it? Well, essentially, they were all fascists, which means they wanted control of not only individuals, but control of corporations. And the way you obtain control is to control money, get money out of the hands of the people and force them to use fiat currency because of legal tender laws and other types of rules and requirements and restrictions that prevent the circulation of money, gold and silver.
When you talk about fascism and controlling the corporate entities, it seems that's a path that we had been going down for the last several years, with whether it be the automobile industry, with GM, with medical industry, with social
How about banks?
Media. Pardon me?
How about banks?
And banks, of course, absolutely.
All the bailouts?
Absolutely. And all the bailouts. And, it's funny, it's interesting. I don't know how many people even understand that law was quietly changed into bail-ins. And as an aside, with the first bail-in that we saw in Lindsay, Oklahoma just a few weeks ago, that's gained zero attention. Zero. Makes you wonder what they have in store for us. But I digress. Let's change gears just a little bit here. I was surprised the other day when our friend Jerome Powell suggested that Bitcoin competes more directly with gold than it does with the U.S. dollar. From your perspective, and then there's been a lot of talk about this, does Bitcoin have the potential to change or even replace gold's role in the global financial system, or is that a lot of rhetoric?
Bitcoin has a role to play. Let me explain how I came to it. Because of my involvement with money for many, many years, I read the Satoshi Nakamoto paper when it came out in 2007, 2008. And I saw the first transaction where Bitcoin was used as like 5,000 Bitcoin or 7,000 Bitcoin to buy a slice of pizza back in, I guess, 2008, maybe 2009. And at first I was skeptical. I didn't really, take to it. But eventually I began to understand what it represented. And when it reached the then price of $100 a coin, I became an enthusiast, and I remain an enthusiast for a couple of reasons. First of all, Bitcoin and gold are complementary to one another. The advantages of one are the disadvantages of the other, and vice versa. So, for example, gold you can hold in your hand, Bitcoin you cannot. Bitcoin cannot be confiscated based on current technology, but as we just were discussing, gold's been confiscated not only in the 20th century, but throughout history by autocrats. So it's a form of diversification, but there's another bigger message that I think the younger generation and even people who understand finance are finally starting to grasp. With the formation of the Bank of England in 1694, we've been using money substitutes as currency rather than money itself. In other words, we're using paper banknotes, we're using bank ledger currency, and things like that to make payments and to send money all around send value all around the world. That technology, when the Bank of England was created, was significant at the time. But recognize what it is. It's a liability of a bank. As a liability, you're dependent on the assets of the bank. When we were in the gold standard, 40% of those assets were supposed to be gold. At least that was the rule created by Sir Isaac Newton when he invented the gold standard in 1697 and told the Bank of England to keep 40% of your gold against your banknotes in order to provide a cushion to make sure there was always a sufficient reserve. We've moved very, very far away from that. But one point I would like to make, and it relates directly to Bitcoin, money and currency are different. Money is a tangible asset. It's a natural element of the earth. Currency, gold and silver can also be currency in the form of coins, but they're not really used that way anymore. Currency, on the other hand, it evolves and changes. It started as a lump of gold or a lump of silver. Eventually, it was minted into a disc. Then governments took over to guarantee the refinement, and the leaders put their face on the coin in order to confirm that the refinement or what the weight of gold was supposed to be or weight of silver was supposed to be was exactly what it had in the coin, and that created the opportunity for debasing coinage over time. But it continued to evolve and develop. They created the milling around the edge of a coin so it couldn't be clipped and debase the value of the coin. When the Bank of England was created, that was also a new technology. Rather than spend the coins in commerce, leave the coins in the bank and use this piece of paper. It's more convenient. It doesn't wear out. Because if you use gold and silver hand to hand, eventually you have attrition as that coin wears out. And that's very expensive to the treasury of the country that was coining those gold and silver coins. So then you had, after bank liabilities now circulating as a money substitute as currency continued to evolve. You had a checkbook issued in 1844 after the Banking Act was passed here in the UK. After that, instead of going into a bank and borrowing £100 and getting 100 pounds of banknotes, you'd get a checkbook and walk out with a checkbook and send a check within the banking system. Then you had wire transfers, and then you had plastic cards in the last century. Now you've got digital currency, and Bitcoin is one sample of that. And the interesting thing about Bitcoin is it's not a liability of a bank. It's not a liability of anybody. So a lot of people think it's fiat currency in that sense because it's not backed by anything tangible. But it is backed by something called maths. And that math, based on current technology, is unbreakable. And personally, I would rather put my faith in math than I would politicians or central bankers. So I do think Bitcoin, for those reasons, has a role to play. And I do think it will have an impact in the near term. But at some point in time in the future, Bitcoin will no longer, be around. How that will evolve, I don't know. But I think Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin, eventually realized that. And for that reason, he decided at some point in time in the future, the process to create Bitcoins would stop. And by that time, humanity would go to something else. But I believe that gold particularly would still have a role to play. Silver maybe less so because it has such an important industrial component, particularly with solar and medicine and things like that. But gold, it doesn't do anything other than provide economic calculation that's useful over time. An ounce of gold today buys the same amount of crude oil it did 70 years ago. And they say an ounce of gold today buys a man's suit, whereas, in Roman times it bought a toga for a Roman senator. Why does gold do that? It's because it's natural money and the way it's dispersed in the Earth's crust, which we can get into in more detail if you're interested in hearing my views on that.
Yeah, why not? Absolutely. I mean, if you've been in this market long enough, you throw those analogies around where, a $20 gold piece was an ounce of gold that bought a suit in 1933. Well, that $20 doesn't even buy a pair of shoelaces today, hardly, but that ounce of gold would still buy you the same suit. Let's talk about that a little bit. I'd be interested in learning your perspective.
The question is why? Why does that happen? And it happens because gold is accumulated. That's why gold is not a commodity, or one of the many reasons gold is not a commodity. It exists in the above-ground stock. All the gold mined throughout history, if you put it into a cube, you could slide it under the arches of the Eiffel Tower. So that's one element of it. But the way it's dispersed, it's only produced when it's profitable to mine it. If it's not profitable, it just sits there in the ground. But as it becomes more and more profitable, we mine it. Today miners are developing very profitable mines in Nevada where old timers, even 70, 80 years ago, were walking over it because it was just dirt. There's gold everywhere, but getting it out of the earth or getting it out of the ocean, there's a ton of gold in every square mile of ocean, costs money and costs time. So it's only mined when it's profitable to do so. And now here's the key point. And I've analyzed this and I've written about it, that if you look at how gold accumulates, it grows by the above ground stock of gold, this cube that goes under the Eiffel Tower, grows consistently more or less by about 1.75% per annum, year after year after year. Even in a bonanza year like 1849 with the gold discovery in California, it only grew by 3% in that 1 year, compared to the U.S. dollar, which in 2020 grew by 20% in 1 year. The supply of dollars. So it grows consistently by 1.75% per annum. And as technology improves, we can mine the gold that had previously been considered unprofitable by the old timers. So in South Africa, for example, 120 years ago, you could sink a shaft maybe 1,000 feet, and it would cost maybe this much weight of gold. Today, you can sink a shaft in South Africa 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers deep, and it costs the same amount of gold. Why is that? Is it because it's purposeful, intelligent design of a creator, or is it just spontaneity? Happenstance that this one planet, for whatever reasons, was created or arose, came into existence in that way that gold was dispersed in that particular, with those particular features and circumstances. So the question is, gold is the only thing in the known universe that cannot be destroyed. Is it here for a purpose? Yes, obviously it's here for a purpose. It's natural money. And when we ignore it, we go off on a tangent like we are today. Just like what happened with the framers of the Constitution. The first currency of the country was the Continental. And it got destroyed with hyperinflation. And one of the reasons the framers created a more perfect union was because of the monetary provisions. They didn't want what happened to them to happen to their progeny. So they put Article 1, Section 8 for the coining of money and prohibited the states from issuing and are accepting anything but gold or silver as a form of payment. And we've ignored that. And as a consequence, we're suffering the same consequences that they did with the Continental. It's not a big surprise in my view.
I'm feeling silly for a moment. I've been doing this for 35 years, and I'd like you to elaborate on what you mean about gold cannot be destroyed. I mean, I think I know where you're going with this, but what do you mean?
Just that. You can't destroy it. You could smash it. You can try to break it up, but gold is gold. You put acid on it, doesn't affect it. That's why these Spanish galleons that have been under the ocean, salt water for 400 years, 500 years, it has no impact on gold. It just exists. It's the only thing in the known universe that I say is eternal. You cannot destroy it.
You can melt it into liquid, and when it cools, it's solid again. Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. I should have stole that from you a long time ago. Of course, giving you the props.
It's natural money is the best way to describe it. It's the only element in the known universe that is indestructible.
You get into the philosophical and you wonder, geez, was it put here for a reason by the creator? Is that what it was? Is it intended to be money, to facilitate commerce? Interesting discussion for another time, but I appreciate your perspective on that. It's fascinating. Once again, let's shift BRICS. Let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about BRICS. I mean, this is something I've followed for a long time, and it's a very dynamic, changing environment. Trump saying we're going to put 100% tariffs on the BRICS nations unless they agree not to work towards a new unified currency. And I think tariffs in general are okay, but these aren't tariffs. These are tariffs that are actually masquerading as a sanction, really. What are your thoughts on the BRICS? What are your thoughts on Trump pushing back against them? Is this a legitimate entity, or is it just something that is a passing fad?
Yeah, it relates really, I think, to America's position, within the globe. Let me start by saying that, there is a lot of talk about being end of empire. We were never supposed to be an empire, first of all. We were supposed to be a republic, self-represented, with democracy, with representation in Congress, or representation in your state legislature. We've come a long way, and when you see things like tariffs, or more obviously the walls, if you look at the history of walls, the Great Wall of China, Hadrian's Wall, the Berlin Wall, the wall on the southern border now, it's sort of an indication that this wall might be just like these other walls. It was a sort of signal that it was an end of empire, end of era. And this talk about making tariffs 100% to force the acceptance of the dollar, that's very similar. It shows us, in my view, a position of weakness, not a position of strength. If you have good money, people will accept it and use it without any question. If you have money that's junk, controlled by politicians who are spending money recklessly, and a central bank who kowtows to whatever the federal government wants in terms of its spending aspirations, you're going to have people saying, hey, I don't want to have my purchasing power being taken away at 2% per annum. I mean, 2% inflation is an outrage, really. Let me go back again, a little bit of history here to put it into perspective, because everything we see and hear in the 20th century is basically total nonsense. It's not the way the world worked for thousands of years, or the way the world is supposed to work, going forward in the future. In the Mint Act of 1792, it clearly states that if you debase the currency, that it's a felony punishable by death. The framers of the Constitution understood how important money is to economic calculation, wealth accumulation, and the ability for the average guy to save his purchasing power for an uncertain future, rather than expect his future is going to be taken care of for him by some government or some corporation or anything like that. So, how did that thinking from 1792 and pretty much up to the 20th century change to what we have today, that 2% inflation is acceptable? It's not acceptable. It's an outrage in my view. And the system that we have is near its end. What will replace it? I don't know. But we can go either the right way or the wrong way, in my view. The framers of the Constitution went the right way. They recognized the problems of fiat currency, and they put in the Constitution the monetary provisions. And it worked more or less pretty well up until the 20th century and the gold confiscation by Roosevelt. There were some issues regarding fractional reserve banking and creating creating currency out of thin air, which we can discuss if you'd like. But more or less, a gold standard provides the discipline that is needed on the money creation process. And that discipline, as I said, comes from gold because however it's dispersed and only mined when it's profitable to do so, it grows, it's above ground stock, just grows about 1.75% per annum year after year after year. That's the discipline. And that's approximately equal to new wealth creation, which is why gold does maintain its purchasing power over long periods of time. I guess maybe we're getting off a little bit on
No, I love it. No, that's the whole idea of this discussion. It's every other interview you're on, you're just toting the line. I like going deeper, and I don't care where it goes. And it's interesting. Maybe if we would listen to our founding fathers, been more of a republic, stayed out of everyone else's affairs, not strive to be an empire, we would realize that for 180 years on the gold standard, we had zero inflation and the greatest prosperity the world had ever seen. Things changed, as you say, with the Federal Reserve and the confiscation of gold, and not for the better. And that's why I think maybe, just maybe, there is a sliver of possibility that, we realize we need to have some sort of a gold pegging to a system. Maybe it's a marriage between blockchain technology and gold, like the BRICS we're talking about with their unit token. And maybe it's even as far as the IMF with Kristalina Georgieva acknowledging CBDCs that are not pegged to something are just the same thing. They are fiat. So I couldn't agree with you more. And it's sad that we've diverged so far away from the wisdom that somehow our founding fathers had that, to me, is timeless and has been conveniently usurped. I'm certainly hoping for that. The other day, I interviewed a mutual friend of ours, Chris Powell, and I could throw you into this. As a longtime consultant of GATA, I have always said, in probably 200 instances publicly, that we owe a debt of gratitude to Bill Murphy and Chris Powell for what they have done, their tireless pursuit of exposing the manipulation of the gold market. It's a topic that a lot of people haven't really ever given credibility to. I think it's pretty well understood now that the metals market has been manipulated for a very long period of time. And with your extensive knowledge of the gold market manipulation, your involvement with GATA, I'm going to ask you the question that you've been asked 5 million times, that I've been asked 5 million times, and that is, will it ever end? Is it ever going to get to a point where it's just gone? Or is it that far entrenched in the dynamic that it may not ever fully disappear? I'd be curious to your thoughts.
Yeah, I'd like to believe that it is going to end. I mean, what GATA has done has been truly remarkable. They've communicated to the world some key elements, behind the monetary systems that's come to exist, and gold confiscation is a key component of that. But let's put it into perspective again, like we've been doing with some of these other points. What central banks, when the Bank of England was first created, and what other central banks intended to do when we were under the gold standard, was they were to maintain the value, manage the value of their banknotes in such a way that they would always have the same purchasing power as gold would have, so that you could use this banknote and it would be as good as gold. That was the expression that we used to use in the 1960s when we were talking about the dollar. It was as good as gold. But after, the 1960s, it no longer was as good as gold because of the debasement and everything that occurred. And along the way, starting in the end of the 19th century, bank, and just before the progressives started taking hold in the 20th century, banks and governments started realizing, and central banks started realizing, that if they created more regimentation on the people, they wouldn't have to maintain 40% of the gold in reserve. They could go down to, 30%, 20%, or a lot less. And it's what I call my fear index. We're now down to, recently we're down to just a couple percent, but the fear index has been rising since October 2022. And I think it's going to continue to rise. The fear index is basically the value of the reserves relative to the amount of dollars circulating as currency. And you can apply the fear index on a global basis as well, not just for the dollar. You can actually apply it to any currency, assuming that the central bank of that currency has some gold in reserve. And there are questions about whether the U.S. really has that gold in reserve or not, which is a whole nother topic and a whole nother discussion. But the manipulation started, really with the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. And if you read the literature at the time, the Federal Reserve has purposely tried to take gold out of circulation and put Federal Reserve notes in circulation, hold the gold in reserve, because the more gold you held in reserve at that time, the more loans you could make. And the more loans you could make, the more the bankers would profit from those loans. And that in turn, created this environment where the collaboration between central banks and governments became pretty much a one-way street. Instead of championing free markets and gold and silver as money, central banks started championing, government control. And after the 1930s, then fascism that entered the world in the 1920s and 30s became even more so. So as a consequence of, bad economic theory from Keynes and others, the socialist movement to put more control in government rather than individuals taking care of themselves and being, having their families being part of the element that takes control of the individuals and their future. And all of the other nasty things that have happened in the 20th century, we've moved away from all of these basic principles and we end up where we are today. So I come back to, what we were talking about before. Do we go the right way, like the framers of the Constitution, or do we go the wrong way? Like, say, the Germans after the collapse of the Reichsmark in the 1923-24, which created the opportunity for Hitler to propagandize the need for order where there was none because there was chaos. Or, like Venezuela or any of the other countries today that, are suffering from monetary consequences.
With as many times as we've heard the name Hitler bantered around lately, I really hope we don't go that way. I always found it interesting that the largest insurance policy issued in Germany prior to the war was never cashed out after the war because the postage stamp to send it into the insurance company was worth more than the policy. So let's hope for our children and grandchildren. I know that you have some grandchildren and two sons, and I have 3 kids and no grandkids yet that I know of. But let's hope that we don't go that direction. But we
might, which is why we have to accumulate physical gold and physical silver, because the future is uncertain. We just don't know how it's going to unfold. So we have to be our own central banks. We have to own that gold and silver. That's the bedrock asset in your portfolio. Once you have that, then you can go ahead and make investments. But saving money is the first step.
James, what you said just now is how I've lived my life since I was 19 years old, and it makes so much sense to me. It's hard for me to even explain to you how that is the way that I think. And I try and explain that to people. My show, all the 5,000 podcasts I've done, and my friends, and it's tough. So tough that, again, our mutual friend Rick Rule will tell you that only 0.5% of the entire financial matrix, from Joe and Jane six-pack all the way up to the Harvard Endowment Fund, has anything allocated to metals. Given this, is there a misconception about gold or precious metals that you wish more people understood? I'd love to know it. Maybe help me convince more people that gold is money and not an investment, but it just seems that it's not really understood anymore. Is there something that you think people should know, if you could phrase that in a short little answer?
Yeah, it's really understanding what money is. we all intuitively understand what water is, as an example. So to say wet water, that would be absolutely silly. So to say sound money or hard money or any of those types of adjectives is just as silly. If in the 19th century you'd said hard money to a person living at that moment in time, they would just say, "Oh yeah, gold and silver." People have to understand once again, gold and silver are money. Everything else is a money substitute circulating as currency in place of money. After all, what is currency supposed to do? Currency just conveys purchasing power. And the most liquid form of purchasing power is the purchasing power that's held in money. And gold and silver are the most liquid because they don't have counterparty risk. It's not dependent upon some bank or some government when you want to spend that purchasing power. It's finding somebody who is willing to accept a payment for gold or in gold or silver for the good or service that you're willing to buy, which is why Alan Greenspan told Congress it's always the final form of payment. Once currencies are destroyed because of inflation or government restrictions of one sort or another.
All right, last question for you before I ask you how people can find out more about you. Do you think, I've said a lot that the actions we've seen over the last several years are too stupid to be stupid, implying that some of this has been planned in an effort to bring in some sort of a reset. You think we're on that path? Is that what the people that have been pulling the strings have been trying to do? Do we have to have some sort of a reset, right, wrong, or indifferent, in order to perhaps get past this damage that has been created with the brain dead monetary policy and the gross irresponsibility of our fiscal policy to where we are now, 36 trillion plus in debt, almost 200 trillion in unfunded liabilities? Do we have to go through that reset, kind of like the Shawshank Redemption? Do we need to crawl through that 2-mile tunnel of crap to get to the other side? Or is there a way to get to the other side to regain our prominence without going through that kind of a reset or that kind of pain?
Sadly, there is going to have to be a reset of some sort, and there is going to be some pain. But we have choices. And I again look to history. After the war between the states, the greenback was created by Lincoln in order to finance the war. It was an unconstitutional piece of paper that people accepted during wartime. And after that, everybody wanted to go back onto a silver standard. And they did. It was a 10-year plan to resume conversion of paper back into silver coin. We were silver standard until 1900 when the Gold Standard Act was passed, and along with most countries around the world started adopting gold as the standard for measurement, because silver started having a large industrial demand. Back then, the demand was for photography, the new industry, photography, and things like that. You can create, like we did, or like the federal government did, for its coining responsibilities. Back after the war, have a 10-year plan, what needs to be done. That's more than a 4-year term of a president, but maybe even a 4-year plan would be better than not having any plan whatsoever. Because if you don't have any plan whatsoever, there's going to be a lot of painful adjustments. And again, this is part of the reason why I stress that individuals should accumulate physical gold and physical silver to minimize any pain that comes as a consequence of government actions to put the country and the monetary system back in the right direction. Most polls show 75% of the people saying the country's headed in the wrong direction. That itself suggests that a reset of some sort is going to be coming. And let's hope it's the right kind of reset. We've got the guidelines. They're in the Constitution. All we have to do is go back to what existed up until 1913, let's say.
All right, I lied, James. I got one more question for you. I'm sorry.
Okay. No problem.
In the same vein, the head of the Dutch National Bank keep saying we need to revalue the gold. Still held on their balance sheet at $35 an ounce all throughout Europe, 42.22 here in the United States. Senator Cynthia Loomis from Wyoming has talked about revaluing the price of gold and taking some of the proceeds of this revaluation to use to buy Bitcoin for the strategic Bitcoin account that Trump had talked about in Tennessee. You had mentioned a number where you take the money in circulation and you divide it by the number of ounces. I think James Rickards recently did that with M1 and comes out to $27,000 an ounce. You talk about 40% gold backing throughout history. That is what the BRICS had talked about or are talking about, pegging their new unit currency to 40%, giving you 60% monetary latitude. With all of that in mind, and by the way, you can't make this up, I'm sure you know this, but on every central bank balance sheet, it's held gold, that is, in their account called the gold revaluation account. I did an interview recently with Tom Luongo, and I believe it was Tom who said he did not believe that the Fed will stop gold's rise, that instead of massively revaluing it like that, they'll let it stair step up, 3 up, 1 back, 3 up, 2 back, 2 up, 1 back, but let it keep ratcheting higher to reliquify the balance sheet of the Fed. Do you see, this is a double question tied to the last question, and that is simply this: at the other end of the reset, is gold part of the new system? And if so, is it revalued to a much higher level in order to make the system work? Does it have to be as high as James Rickards says, 27,000, or maybe even much higher? I'll leave that up to you.
Yeah. Let me just say about that 40%. The Federal Reserve Act in 1913, if you read it, it required a 40% gold reserve. So, again, people understood, back then what gold was. And that's why J.P. Morgan, who was the most preeminent financier at the time, when he testified in Congress in 1912, he said, money is gold. He didn't say gold is money. He said money is gold, because the Gold Standard Act of 1900 made it the legal requirement that gold was money. And that was confirmed by the unconstitutional Federal Reserve Act. But anyway, getting to your point about a revaluation, gold will have a role to play whether government uses it or not. It will exist. It will continue to preserve wealth, but it may not be in government circles. And governments may try to outlaw it or confiscate it again, just like they've done in the past. But individuals themselves will continue to hold it and use it wherever possible in order to conduct commerce, to do things to improve their standard of living, to fulfill their needs and their wants. They work in order to generate purchasing power, and the best way to put that purchasing power for future use is to accumulate gold and silver. It exists in the coins themselves. Now, if the value of gold goes up, it's because the purchasing power of the dollar goes down. And I don't rule out any number in the future. It could be 10,000, which is a number that I've been using for a long time. It could be 27,000. It could be much higher, as you suggest as a possibility. It depends what central banks do. In fact, the gold price could even go down in the future, and you'll still be happy, because if the fear index rises in an environment where the quantity of money is decreasing, if the fear index goes from, say, 3% today to 30%, the purchasing power conveyed by gold will increase tenfold. So regardless whether you have inflation or deflation in the future, which cannot be predicted because it depends on what central banks do with the national currency, you're going to be better off owning gold because it is so undervalued now compared to its historical ratios. And it's just a question of hoping that we don't have a painful reset, and that government at various levels, whether it starts at the states or starts at the federal level, common sense prevails, and we go back to a monetary system that's sustainable. The one that we have today is not sustainable. You can't predict how things are going to unfold, but you can predict that they will unfold in a certain way. Because if you're going down a road that is unsustainable because there's a cliff at the end of that road, you're going to go over that cliff eventually. You don't know when, but what you have to do to avoid that is you have to get off that road and go in the other direction. And so far, I've seen no sign whatsoever that the federal government or even the state governments, really, because they play along with the federal government rather than enforcing their rights, are all heading down that same road. And that's quite worrying and quite scary for the future.
Yes, that road is little by little, then all at once, I guess you could say. So we'll finish on that. Very apropos. James, you're amazing, brother. How can people find out more about what you're currently up to, your social media? Of course, we'll post all of those links at the bottom of the page, but what's the best way for people to follow you and keep abreast of what's going on with
Well, I'm a founder of GoldMoney. You can find out about us. We're listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange under the symbol XAU. But my writings, you can find those on my website, which is fgmr.com, freegoldmoneyreport.com. There's a lot there, including this last article that I was talking about how to make America great again, and what my recommendations would be to President Trump if I were advising him. So that's really the most of it. But there's a lot of stuff on the internet that has accumulated over the years. So if you Google my name, James Turk, you'll find a lot of it.
I read that. I think that probably would have dominated questions I ask you. We'll save that for next time. I will check that out. And I wonder how many people are envious as heck at you that you got that ticker symbol on the Toronto Stock Exchange, for goodness sake. XAU, what a good one. James, I appreciate it, my man. I really do. Thanks for coming on. I wish you and your family nothing but the best in this upcoming holiday season. Happy holidays and a happy, healthy new year to you and your family. I do hope to have you back on the show again down the road. And thanks again, buddy. It was fascinating. Yeah, hope you take care.
I'd love to do it again, Andy. I mean, we've got some interesting times coming up, so there's going to be a lot to talk about. So whenever you would like, just give me a call and be happy to get back on your show.
I will. And that's a Chinese.
And happy holiday season to you as well before I forget.
Thank you very much, James. And I was just saying that's a Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. So indeed they are, but I'd rather know what's coming and be able to sidestep it and get out of the way, because people who can't see what's coming can't get out of the way of what's coming. So thanks for sharing a little bit.
We should be thankful for living in interesting times, because what I think is going to happen is you're going to have the greatest wealth accumulation and redistribution in history. And you want to be part of that and be on the right side of it. And there are many, many opportunities to do that. And one of the best is accumulating physical gold and physical silver.
Appreciate that. Always opportunity in chaos. James, you stay well. And thanks again, buddy. Look forward to picking up where we left off real soon.
Thanks, Andy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Little by Little with Andy Schectman.